What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish at the Moment. In this video, I want to talk about the proper casting angle as well as your boat position when you're fishing down the bank. So let's get into it. So let's start with your casting angle. And there are a lot of angles you can cast at a bank. The first is just straight to the bank. You can cast at a 45-degree angle, a 60-degree angle, or straight ahead of the boat. And the reason I cast at different angles towards the bank is to ensure that my bait stays in a specific strike zone or depth range. To explain this, let's take a look at a bank here. Basically, I believe that there are several strike zones or depth zones these fish will be in any given day. And so you may have a strike zone from 0 to 2 feet of water, and maybe a strike zone from 2 to 5 feet of water, and then 5 to 8 feet of water, 8 to 12 feet of water, 12 to 15 feet of water, so on and so forth. And in my experience, I've found that there's going to be a specific depth zone or strike zone where the majority of the active fish are going to be on any given day. And so my goal when I go to the lake is first to identify which depth zone or strike zone those fish are using that day, and then I want to keep my bait in that depth zone as long as possible by adjusting my casting angle and my boat positioning. So let's start with the 45-degree casting angle. And this is my go-to casting angle when I'm just trying to cover water and fish down the bank. And basically what I'm gonna do is just cast somewhat in front of the boat at a 45-degree angle to the bank. And this will allow me to bring my bait back to the boat and stay in each depth zone for a decent amount of time. My bait will stay in the 2 to 5 foot depth zone for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and then if I work that bait out even further, it might stay in that 5 to 8 foot depth zone for maybe, again, 5 to 10 seconds, and then if I keep working it out, it might make its way all the way out to that 10 to 15 foot strike zone. And so I'm able to work all the different strike zones and keep my bait in each strike zone for a decent amount of time. And in my experience, I find that 45-degree casting angle is the most efficient way to cover water when you don't know what depth zone those fish are in. And a lot of guys will cast their bait directly at the bank and try to work it out. And the problem with this approach is that you're not going to keep your bait in one strike zone for very long. It may stay in that 2 to 5 foot zone for just a couple hops, or if you're fishing like a spinnerbait or a crankbait, just a second or two. And then as you move it further away from the bank, you're going to be moving into that 5 to 8 foot strike zone, then that 8 to 12 foot strike zone very quickly. And your bait doesn't give the fish much of a chance in those strike zones to actually commit to it. You're moving it through those zones too quickly. But with that 45-degree angle cast, that bait stays in each zone a little bit longer, and you can actually adjust how long you're going to be in each zone by how far you position your boat away from the bank. The further you are away from the bank and the steeper that angle is, the longer you're going to keep that bait in each of those zones. And that brings us to the next casting angle, which is the 60-degree casting angle. And this casting angle covers fewer zones in that 45-degree angle because basically you're casting it almost directly in front of the boat, but not quite. And so you may be able to keep that bait in, let's say, that 2 to 5 foot strike zone for 8 to 12 seconds if you're fishing that bait somewhat slowly. And then it takes a while for that bait to move from that 2 to 5 foot strike zone to the 5 to 8 foot strike zone, and so on and so forth. And I really like this approach when I know how deep the fish are. For example, if I start with that 45-degree casting angle and I figure out that I'm getting most of my bites in that 5 to 8 foot strike zone, what you can do is you can use that 60-degree casting angle to keep your bait in that 5 to 8 foot strike zone a lot longer, which is going to give you more probability of getting a bite because you're keeping your bait where those fish are a lot longer. And so that's one of the keys to fishing down the bank, keeping your bait in the depth zone where the fish are as long as possible. And then we can actually take this to the extreme and cast directly in front of the boat and basically just cover one depth zone at a time. Rather than trying to fish maybe 2 or 3 depth zones at once, you're really just gonna focus on one depth zone when you're casting straight ahead of the boat. And this is really great when you know exactly where those fish are, and especially when those fish are a little bit further off the bank. So if you know those fish are in, let's say, the 8 to 12 foot depth zone, and that's where you're getting all your bites, a lot of times I'll position my boat so that I can cast directly ahead of the boat and drag my jig or my crankbait or wherever I'm fishing in that exact depth zone where those fish are. Now, this isn't a good way to start out fishing your day because if you don't know what depth zone those fish are in, then you could be fishing the wrong depth zone all day. So it is better to start with that 45-degree angle just so that you can try a bunch of different depth zones. But once you figure out what zone those fish are in, then a lot of times going to that straight ahead cast, straight out the front of the boat is the way to go. And a lot of you guys may have been told to parallel a bank when fishing a crankbait or a spinnerbait on, let's say, riprap or a bluff wall. And the idea behind paralleling a bank is to keep your bait in that key strike zone or depth range the entire cast. The problem is that if you're paralleling the bank in that 2 to 5 foot strike zone and all of those fish are in that 8 to 12 foot strike zone, it's kind of pointless. And so if someone tells you to parallel the bank, make sure you don't just immediately go right up to the bank and fish super shallow and parallel in 2 to 5 feet of water. Test out those different strike zones first before you actually commit to paralleling the bank. That way you know that you're actually putting your bait in a zone that the fish are in and you're not going right over the top of them. And one more thing I want to point out is that a lot of guys will parallel the bank or cast straight ahead of their boat when they're pretty close to the bank, and they'll target that 0 to 5 foot zone. But a lot fewer guys will actually fish deeper than that while casting ahead of the boat. And I actually have a lot of success targeting the 8 to 25 foot zone when I'm paralleling down banks. And a lot of times this means my boat is somewhere between 20 and 40 feet off the bank and I'm casting straight ahead of the boat. And it felt really weird to do this when I started fishing this way, but the reason I did is because I found that a lot of the fish on these Ozark lakes, as well as basically any lake that has rocky shorelines, will set up further off the bank in the spring as well as in the fall, and they won't be right up against the bank, but they'll be using underwater rocks or laydowns, things like that. They're out in 15 to 20 foot of water, again maybe 20 to 40 feet off the bank as their home. And so if you are fishing a lake that has some really rocky shorelines, don't be afraid to try to fish a little bit deeper off those banks, and once you find a good depth zone with that 45 or 60 degree angle cast straight ahead of the boat, even if it feels a little bit weird at first.
Next thing I want to talk about is boat positioning. And what I mean by that is how far away your boat is from the bank when you're fishing down it. And there are a couple factors that influence my boat positioning as I'm fishing down the bank. The first is whether I'm actually trying to fish shallow cover like laydowns, rocks, things like that, they're up on the bank, as well as the actual slope of the bank. So let's start with the slope of the bank. And what I mean by the slope is how gradual or steep that bank is as it comes from the shoreline into the middle of the lake or a creek or a pocket. And in general, I like to start by keeping my boat somewhere around that 20 to 25 foot zone. And I'll just keep my boat positioned as far off the bank as it takes to get in that zone. So for example, right now, my boat is sitting in 16 feet of water. And so if I was fishing down this bank, I may want to move a little bit further off the bank so that I can keep my boat in that 20 foot zone. When I make my 45-degree cast like this, I'm covering all those different zones from 2 foot of water up there all the way out to that 10 to 12 foot of water. If you're too close, a lot of times you're going to limit the number of zones you can fish, especially when these banks have a very subtle slope, or I guess a gentle slope, not subtle, but a gentle slope, and you basically have to cover a lot of ground to cover all those different depth zones. But then sometimes you might find that you're fishing a very steep bank and 20 foot of water might just be 5 or 10 feet off the bank itself because that bank has a super steep slope. And so in that case, I'm going to position my boat much closer to the shoreline. And I said that I like to keep my boat in that 20 to 25 foot zone when I start fishing down the bank. But obviously sometimes your lakes may not even be 25 feet deep, and so you may have to start a little bit shallower than that, let's say 8 to 10 feet of water. Or if your lake is super, super deep and clear, you might need to start your boat in 40 feet of water. So it kind of depends lake to lake. I would say 20 foot is kind of a good guideline, at least for the most of the lakes in the country. But if your lake is really shallow, sometimes deep water is relative, and you may only need to put your boat in like 10 foot of water and cast up shallower. And then the last thing that affects my boat positioning is whether I'm fishing shallow cover or not. And so most of the time, if I'm flipping and pitching shallow cover, especially in dirty water, I want to keep my boat relatively close to the cover so I can make nice accurate pitches to what I'm fishing. And the further you get away from the cover, the harder it is to actually make those pinpoint casts. But sometimes you might find that if you're fishing really clear water or with a lot of fishing pressure around, you might need to actually keep your boat further off the bank and make longer presentations to not spook the fish. And so there are times when I will pull my boat further off the bank, even in that dirty water, but especially in that clear water. And so in that case, you'll want to make sure you're keeping your boat maybe 15 to 30 feet away from the bank and making longer presentations up to the areas you want to fish.
And this is really important if you're a tournament fisherman, because a lot of times when you're fishing tournaments, you're gonna be fishing around other competitors. And most people will keep their boat relatively close to shallow cover when they're fishing it so they can make more accurate presentations. But if you can get better at your roll casting or distance casting and still present that bait quietly from maybe 30 or 40 feet away from the target, a lot of times you can get 2 to 3 times the number of bites that your competitors are getting just because you're staying further away from those fish and they don't feel that boat pressure as much. And you may need to do this by throwing a spinning rod and maybe like skipping a weightless worm or a wacky rig around some of these shallow areas, or just getting better at roll casting with a jig. And if you do want to learn how to get better at roll casting, I do have some videos on my channel specifically about casting that will help you make your casts a lot more quietly as well as accurately when you're on the lake.
Okay guys, that's it for this video. It was pretty straightforward, but hopefully it'll help some of you guys be a little more efficient when you're fishing down the bank and be more confident in what you're doing when you get to the lake. So if you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment down below letting me know what you think. Leave a like as well if you really liked it. And other than that, I'll see y'all in the next one.